questions that kind of dovetail here. Related to balancing working capital fluctuations. That's one question. Suggestions on balancing working capital fluctuations. And here's another one that seems to be related, so maybe I can group them. Are there additional factors to consider if there has been a recent change in distribution channels where there is little, quote, trailing 12-month, unquote, history to factor in?
Yeah, I mean, if the business has shifted dramatically, then yeah, the 12 months is not reflective of the working capital needs going forward, right? So, if you change your distribution channels and it's a huge change in the business, then the 12 months average is not reflective of the business. So how do you handle that? I mean, that's a negotiation with the buyer, right? So you go to the buyer, say, hey, we just had a major change in distribution channels. I think our working capital needs are going to be different. And if the buyer's smart, they'll figure out a good number so everybody's happy at close and 60 days after close. Or if the buyer wants a little extra security, what I would suggest on that one would be they've got an escrow. The buyer has a certain dollar amount from the purchase price that paid the seller in escrow, and they use that in case they need it, in case the working capital needs rise dramatically in month 3 after they've owned the business. If it's a dramatic increase because of the new distribution agreements, they can take that out of escrow. And if not, then they return that money back to the seller. So there's certain adjustments you can make based on that. But yeah, that's a good question. And, every business is different, and that's why you need to calculate working capital with concern for unusual items like that.
Okay, good. I think that covers both those questions. Then this next one is, if we move into a higher interest rate environment, how should that factor into negotiations?
Well, it's a good question. Higher interest rates really, it's going to affect obviously a lot of the balance sheet. There's no question about that, but primarily long-term debt, which the seller pays in any case, right? And then otherwise, it's not going to affect that much. It might affect your accounts receivable, assuming you have like late payment, 5% interest or what have you in a late payment, but not that much. I don't think it's going to have a huge effect. It certainly will affect M&A because that'll affect the financing you can obtain for an M&A loan, right? Acquisition loan, a loan to buy another company. That'll decrease or actually increase in cost. So that cost will go up. But in terms of working cap, I don't see a huge effect.
Okay. Thank you for that. And then the next question is, in a cash-free deal, what special handling, if any, should be applied to advanced customer deposits received for revenues that will be recognized post-close?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you have to balance the advanced customer deposits with the delivery of goods and services at post-close, right? So if it's $1 for $1, it's not excess. That's what I was trying to point out before. It's not excess cash because that dollar is tied to $1 in the future. So it's not excess. It's $1 that should stay on the balance sheet. There may be other excess cash beyond the advanced customer deposit, but that dollar should stay in the balance sheet.
Okay. Next question. Then thanks to the audience for posting so many questions. It's quite a stimulating discussion that we're having here today, which is fantastic. The next question is, how frequently do you see parties entering into arbitration proceedings during the post-closing adjustment period?
Not that often. I mean, they're typically in the purchase agreement. You're going to define working capital, which can go on. The definition can go on for 3 pages, right? Because it's highly complex, and it should be. It should be a 3-page definition typically. So you define everything. You do your trial balance, as of letter of intent, and typically you do a trial balance every month prior to close, just so everybody has a clear idea of the working capital of the business as it's moving to close. At close, you're going to do a trial balance sheet. Great, you got that. And then every month after close, you're going to do one that's 60 days. You do the true up, and the buyer, as I said before, does the calculations themselves. They show it to the seller, and there may be some negotiation there. The seller said, hey, you're not looking at this cash item here, or this deferred comp here, what have you. So there may be negotiation. That's it. And if they usually agree, so 95% agree. Hey, you're right. This is seller owes the buyer owes seller, right? Typically. Now, if they can't agree, there is a third-party arbitration clause typically in the purchase agreement where it goes to a third party and they will, look at the calculations and come out with their decision 90 days later on who owes whom.
Okay. The next question is, could you talk about surprises that typically go unnoticed and that buyers should have in mind to try to catch them? For example, some revenues that are contested, warranty liabilities, etc.
Yeah, great point. So I'll give you an example of that is accounts receivable is probably the biggest surprise for the buyer, right? And I've been in a transaction like that where, and we did catch, quote unquote, the seller, but, it's not really catching, it's definitional. So, and that goes back to looking at accounts receivable as $1. Okay, that's a line item, but then you got to basically, disaggregate account receivable, looking at that one line item in detail. That's broken down to, 30, 60, 90 days, right? Payables 120, what have you. But some of that account receivable just be written off as bad debt, and the seller may not be doing a good job of that. And then you're buying, accounts receivable that are not going to be turned into cash. That's probably the biggest surprise issue for buyers is buying a business and turns out that, X percent of their accounts receivable they can never collect. The other surprise is that, the vendors have not been informed, and there's a change of ownership, and there's a change of control clause in some of their vendor contracts, and that hasn't been examined either. It should actually. If you buy assets different than buying shares, it's a whole different webinar, but that's change control provision in vendor contracts is key. And thirdly, if there's change control and it's IBM, there may be a different relationship in terms of actually paying the AR, right? They may think they can get it with more or less depending upon what the buyer status is. That's
an interesting, very interesting answer, and also your mention of the separate webinar topic on assets versus shares. We might we'll follow up with you on that one, Ben. That's all right. A good one.
happy to give that one as well. It's always fascinating.
All right, great. Well, that's good. We'll seek to get that scheduled. The next one is how about a case study? You ready?
Go for it.
The situation is cash-free, debt-free transaction. Invoice for software maintenance is raised and paid in January. Closing is end of May. How would you argue that the prepaid portion, for example, 7 months worth of cash, is not considered debt? I can repeat that one.
No, it's okay. I think I got it right. So software maintenance raised and paid in January. So it's paid up front, essentially, right? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
It's paid up front for $1. Let's put another $1 on the table. So your software maintenance paid for $1. Closing of the transaction, I'm assuming, is end of May. And you've still got maintenance going on down the road. I mean, if I was the buyer, I'd say, hey, there's no question that's, that $1 of cash needs to stay in the balance sheet. It's excess cash. It's not all cash. It's not like you go to the closing and the seller can suck out all the cash, because how are you going to pay, your employee the next day, or in this case, not in this case, but a vendor the next day? How are you going to pay somebody the very next day? So it's not all cash and cash free. It's excess cash. That's a key thing. So in this situation, I would argue as the buyer that you keep that $1 of maintenance, software maintenance, in the bank account, because there's obligations tied to that $1 down the road, which is software maintenance.
Okay, great. That's an interesting one in and of itself. The last one I think here was, let's see if it was related to a software as a service. It was many SaaS companies